The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting uneven patterns across the bedroom floor. It was a typical Monday, yet something about the air felt off to me. My marriage of 7 years had settled into a routine, the kind that's predictable and comfortable, but also suffocating. I loved Mark. At least, I told myself I did. Still, the spark that once ignited our nights had dwindled into polite smiles and shared silences over coffee. As I stood in front of the bathroom mirror adjusting my tie, a reminder buzzed on my phone. 11 a.m. annual checkup. I sighed. The checkup was obligatory, an appointment I usually breezed through without much thought. Yet, today, the thought of it lingered, tugging at something I couldn't quite name. I arrived at the clinic 10 minutes early, greeted by the sterile smell of antiseptic and the hum of soft jazz playing overhead. The receptionist, a woman with an immaculate bun and a name tag reading Cynthia, handed me a clipboard. "Dr. Rowan will see you shortly," she said, her voice clipped but pleasant. I settled into a chair, the plastic creaking under my weight. I scanned the room, noting the usual mix of patients scrolling through phones or flipping magazines. My mind drifted to Mark. He'd been distant lately, engrossed in work projects that seemed to matter more than our evenings together. Maybe I'd become distant too. "Mr. Callahan?" The voice pulled me back. I looked up to see him, Dr. Rowan. He stood in the doorway, clipboard in hand, his white coat pressed to perfection. His smile was warm, professional, yet there was something in his eyes, a sharpness that seemed to see through layers. I followed him into the examination room, its walls adorned with motivational posters about health and wellness. Dr. Rowan gestured to the chair by the desk. "Have a seat," he said, settling into his own chair across from me. The routine questions began. "Any new symptoms? Concerns about your health?" His voice was low, measured, with an edge of curiosity that made every word feel significant. "No, nothing unusual," I replied, though my chest tightened slightly as I spoke. "Good. Let's take a look then." I removed my shirt as instructed, feeling oddly exposed under the fluorescent lights. His hands were clinical, yet precise, as he conducted the physical examination. But then, there was a pause, a split second too long when his fingers brushed my shoulder. It could have been nothing, a figment of my overactive imagination. Yet, it left a faint hum beneath my skin, like the aftermath of a static shock. "Everything seems normal," he said, stepping back. His tone was casual, but I caught a flicker of something, hesitation, perhaps, in his expression. "You're in excellent shape, Mr. Callahan." "Call me Liam," I said before I could stop myself. "Liam," he repeated, the syllables rolling off his tongue in a way that made them sound like an invitation. I dressed quickly, eager to shake off the tension that seemed to thicken the air. As he updated my records, I found myself studying him, the way his pen moved fluidly across the page, the slight furrow of his brow. There was a magnetism to him, subtle but undeniable, that left me unnerved. "Well, you're good to go," he said, standing and offering his hand. As our hands met, I felt it again, that hum, that unspoken connection. It was fleeting, gone as quickly as it came, but it lingered in my mind as I walked out of the room. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts circling back to Dr. Rowan. There was nothing inappropriate about our interaction, and yet it felt charged, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Guilt crept in, mingling with curiosity. What was it about him that had disarmed me so completely? By the time I pulled into the driveway, I'd convinced myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment in an otherwise routine day. But as I stepped into the quiet of my house, the echo of his voice lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a husband, not as a patient, but as a man. And that terrified me. The clinic door swung open with a soft chime as I stepped inside for my follow-up appointment. I told myself it was routine, a necessity to confirm everything was fine. Yet, deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. There was a pull, something magnetic about Dr. Rowan that I hadn't been able to shake since the last visit. The waiting room was quiet, save for the muffled conversations from the reception desk. Cynthia looked up, offering a quick nod as I signed in. "He'll be with you shortly, Mr. Callahan," she said with a practiced smile. I sat down, my fingers drumming against the armrest of the chair. A part of me wanted to turn around and leave, to dismiss the lingering thoughts as a moment of weakness. But before I could act on the impulse, his voice broke through. "Liam?" I looked up, and there he was again, standing in the doorway with that same poised demeanor. "Come on in." This time, the examination room felt different. The sterile air was the same, the fluorescent lights just as harsh, but the space seemed smaller, as though the walls had closed in slightly. "How've you been?" he asked, gesturing for me to take a seat on the exam table. "Good. Busy with work," I replied, though my tone betrayed the unease simmering beneath. "Good to hear," he said, his eyes meeting mine for a beat too long before he turned to the computer. As he updated my chart, the silence between us felt weighted. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, noting the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way his hands moved with precision. It wasn't just attraction, it was curiosity, a desire to understand what it was about him that unsettled me so deeply. He finally turned back to me, leaning against the counter with a clipboard in hand. "I want to check something from your last visit. Do you mind?" "No, go ahead," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The examination began, much like before, but this time, the atmosphere was different. His touch was professional, yet it carried an unspoken charge. The room seemed to hum with attention neither of us acknowledged aloud. "Relax your arm," he said, his voice softer now, almost intimate. I complied, feeling the warmth of his hand against my skin as he adjusted my posture. It was such a small gesture, innocuous on the surface, yet it sent a ripple through me. "Any discomfort?" he asked, his tone shifting back to clinical. "No," I replied quickly, though the word felt heavy. When he finished, he stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Everything looks good. You're healthy?" I nodded, but neither of us moved to leave. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until he finally broke it. "Liam," he began, his voice measured. "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "In general," he clarified, his gaze steady. "With your life. Your relationship." I opened my mouth to answer, but the words didn't come. Instead, I looked away, my thoughts spinning. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to answer." The vulnerability in his tone made me turn back to him. For the first time, the professional veneer cracked, revealing a man who wasn't as composed as he seemed. "You don't have to say anything," he continued, "but sometimes it helps to talk." And just like that, the dam broke. I found myself sharing things I hadn't even admitted to myself, how distant Mark and I had become, how I felt like a ghost in my own life. Dr. Rowan listened intently, his expression open and non-judgmental. "I'm sorry," I said when I finally stopped. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." "Don't apologize," he said, his voice firm yet kind. "Sometimes, we need someone who isn't involved to hear us." The moment hung between us, charged with a connection that felt dangerous and thrilling all at once. I wanted to pull away, to retreat into the safety of my marriage, but I couldn't. As I stood to leave, he reached out, his hand brushing my arm. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, stopping me in my tracks. "Take care of yourself, Liam," he said, his voice low. I nodded, unable to speak, and walked out of the room. But as I stepped into the crisp air outside, I knew I'd left something behind, and taken something with me. The boundaries between us had blurred, and there was no going back. The glow of the streetlights stretched across the clinic's parking lot as I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel. The warmth of Dr. Rowan's touch still lingered, a phantom sensation I couldn't shake. The world outside felt distant, muted, as though I'd been transported to a realm where nothing but that room, his presence, existed. I knew I should drive home. Mark would be there, waiting, though I doubted he'd notice if I came home late. The distance between us was no longer just emotional, it had become physical, measured by the silence that filled our shared spaces. Yet, as much as I told myself it was wrong to linger on the edge of something forbidden, I couldn't deny the pull. The following week, I found myself back at the clinic, unannounced. I'd rehearsed the excuse in my head, something about needing clarification on my results, but it sounded flimsy even to me. Still, I couldn't stop myself. Cynthia raised an eyebrow but didn't question my arrival. Dr. Rowan has a gap between patients. I'll let him know you're here. The door to his office opened, and there he stood, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he stepped aside to let me in. Liam, he said, closing the door behind me. I wasn't expecting you. I know, I replied, avoiding his gaze. I just needed to talk. He gestured toward the chair, but I shook my head. Sitting felt too formal, too constricting. Is everything okay? He asked, his voice steady, though there was an edge of concern. No, I said finally, the weight of the confession sinking into the air between us. It's not. The vulnerability in my voice surprised even me. I looked at him, searching for a reaction, and saw it, the same conflict mirrored in his eyes. You're not alone in feeling that way, he said, his tone soft but deliberate. Something inside me cracked. Then why does it feel like I am? He took a step closer, his movements measured, as though afraid to cross an invisible line. Because we convince ourselves that we can't share it, that no one would understand. His words hit harder than I expected, and before I could stop myself, I closed the gap between us. I wasn't thinking, only feeling, the ache, the longing, the need to be seen, truly seen. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the world outside his office ceased to exist. I could hear the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, feel the electric charge in the air. I shouldn't, I whispered, the words a weak attempt at self-restraint. Then don't, he replied, his voice low and heavy with meaning. It happened quickly, his hand brushing against mine, then lingering. A tentative touch became something more, a collision of need and recklessness. His lips met mine, tentative at first, then firm as the tension between us shattered. The kiss was both desperate and deliberate, a culmination of unspoken moments and stolen glances. It wasn't just about desire, it was about connection, about filling the voids we both carried. When we finally pulled apart, the gravity of what had just happened settled over us. I stepped back, my breath uneven, my mind racing. I can't do this, I said, though the conviction in my voice faltered. I know, he replied, his tone laced with both understanding and regret. The room was silent save for the sound of our breathing. He ran a hand through his hair, his composure slipping for the first time since I'd met him. This doesn't have to mean anything, he said, though the words felt hollow. But it does, I countered. And that's the problem. I turned to leave, my hand on the doorknob, but I paused, unable to walk away completely. You make me feel, I trailed off, struggling to find the words. I know, he said simply, his voice filled with the weight of everything we couldn't say. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a jolt back to reality. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I saw Mark's name on the screen. I ignored it, slipping the phone back into my coat. Driving home, I replayed the moment in my head, torn between regret and the undeniable pull of what had happened. The guilt sat heavy in my chest, but so did the memory of his touch, his voice, his presence. When I walked through the door of my house, Mark looked up from his laptop, offering a distracted smile. Hey, how was your day? Fine, I replied, the word feeling like a betrayal. As I stood there, watching him return to his work, I realized that nothing about this moment, or my life, felt fine anymore. I knew I was standing at a crossroads, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. Whatever path I chose, there would be no going back. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure where I belonged. Brings the emotional conflict to its peak, offering both a moment of release and the weight of consequence. It ends on an introspective note, leaving the protagonist's next steps ambiguous but deeply compelling.